So I'm an interdisciplinary artist, and I live in Mount Rainier, Maryland, and we're here in my studio, also in Mount Rainier, Maryland, very close to Anacostia River. And I regularly work with material that is about microhistories of specific sites and places, so I was really excited about this residency opportunity. Because a thread of my work really looks at the ways that policies in the past shape the way that landscapes are formed, and they start to seem really natural to us when we just walk into them as residents many years later. So I came to this practice, I think originally I come from a background in like time-based media and more documentary kind of practice, and was looking for ways to tell stories that are more complex and more engaged with materials and places. And so this particular opportunity to work on the Anacostia River has been really amazing as a way to be able to spend time working in a place that I personally spend a lot of time because of where I live and where I spend my time. So I think I saw the advertisement for the residency in the eCity Art Calls. I think that's where I originally saw it, and it caught my attention both because it was in the middle of the pandemic, and this is a place that's very close to where I live, and so it's a place I've been spending a lot of time over the last several months anyway, and was really interested in being able to take all of those observations that I was having and be able to work on a project that kind of synthesizes them in some way. And I think generally speaking, the project as a whole, I was really interested in kind of looking at the ways that the Anacostia is both amazingly vibrant and amazingly damaged simultaneously, and kind of all the ways that real estate development and environmental protection, all of these things, the way those things connect with how people are living and being able to live well and healthfully along the river. So the project is called Coming In With the Tide, and it's really based on the idea and experience of being on the Anacostia River because it's very slow moving and it's also tidal. So every 6 hours or so, the portion of the river that you're standing next to will be in a slightly different part of the river, but if things that go down don't necessarily go down to stay, they come back with the tide. And so it was really about that very kind of visceral experience of being on the water and seeing this like giant kind of patch of oil and gas kind of move down the river at low tide and come back up at high tide. And so I was looking for a way of kind of taking that idea of how things don't necessarily flow away, but kind of come back with refrain, and looking at the kind of history of the river and how much work that has gone into bringing it back to the place that it is, but the ways that it's been damaged in the past are kind of continually resurfacing. And I think one of the things that has been amazing to get to learn even more about at this point is, in this project, is just how much work and how much care and love for this river has been happening over the last several decades to get it to a point where I could even propose a project like this. So the project itself was kind of taking the idea of what would it be like to look at the Anacostia as a potential of a source of sustenance, as opposed to something that people turn away from in a little bit of fear or disgust, or if they spend time there, they don't necessarily think about it as some place that they could potentially eat from. And historically, this was a place that was incredibly bountiful and abundant, and so I wanted to look at that as a kind of a proposition. What would it mean to for the communities and people who live around this river be able to gain sustenance from it in the way that maybe they might have in the past? So the first step for me over the course of the residency was first to just kind of get more familiar with what the edible plants were in the area. This started with looking at aquatic plants, given the focus of the Kenilworth Aquatic Gardens, but then kind of stretched out from there to include plants that were accessible along the banks, even if you weren't directly in the water. And so I spent an initial period of time just walking and paddling around, just getting to know the place and learning what was growing where, and kind of then taking that information and placing it against information about like where there have been sources of pollution in the past, where there are kind of current sources of pollution, and looking at how those things might interrelate. In addition to looking at the plant material, I also had the opportunity to do soil testing around very specific points where those plants that I was looking at were growing. And so that was in various points along the tidal Anacostia, which basically runs from where it joins the Potomac up to where it separates into two feeder rivers up at Bladensburg, Maryland. So that was the kind of area that I was looking at, and got to take samples along the way. So in proposing to do this, I'm proposing to take on what seems a little bit like a scientific project as an artist. So there was a lot of learning along the way of what it actually means to be taking samples from different locations, and then what you can actually do with that information. So I think the kind of first set of challenges that I ran into was just the actual act of, like, this is a quite long distance, and I was using a borrowed kayak to paddle myself all the way up from Anacostia River Park to Bladensburg, Maryland. It's a pretty long ways. And then in addition to that, I was kind of going into it, kind of conflating two sets of pollutants that are present in the Anacostia River. And they have quite different trajectories for once those things are in the ecosystem. And so on the one hand, those were heavy metals, things that a lot of places that are along the Anacostia had deposited into the river over the years, whether that's lead or arsenic, stuff like that. And then the other are a series of organic pollutants. And those are two very different categories and two very different ways of remediation and testing and all of these things. So what I ended up being able to do for the kind of core of the project was work on the pieces with the heavy metals and get those analyzed, and really ran into this problem where, how am I going to actually address this question of the organic pollutants? In many respects, they are, in the kind of current moment, some of the biggest potential problems. But I really ran into a lack of information of whether that was scientific papers looking at the way that these kinds of pollutants move through plants as opposed to fish. And then also just kind of the process and expense of actually testing for those materials in the plants I was looking at. So based on what I could and couldn't know in the project, I decided that the first thing I would really focus on was kind of gathering and communicating just what kind of abundance is actually possible in the Anacostia River, given the way that things are currently. And part of that stems from all of the work that has been done over the years to rebuild wetlands. And those wetlands both do a lot of work to protect the edge of the river, but also kind of filter pollutants and provide protection against flooding, provide a lot of habitat for animals and birds and things like that along the river. But I was really looking at them as then also these amazing places that were incredibly abundant with plants that are edible and people have eaten in the past. Some of those things people still eat, but not necessarily here, things like wild rice and stuff like that. So the first thing I was doing was just then collecting and drawing all of those different plants, and some of those things like sumac, people are probably really familiar with eating. Some of the things like plantain or dandelion greens, either people are familiar with eating currently or like maybe know from their grandparents. Blackberries, all of these sorts of things, and collecting all of those and mapping both where they are along the river and also kind of pulling them together as a way of like kind of showing what the kind of capacity for sustenance there is here. So many of these places that I was looking at are places that have been planted and then have really kind of grown on their own in the intervening years. So whether that's Bladensburg Marsh or Kingman Lake, those are places that have really, really heavy pollutants in those areas. And when you're paddling around, you can really see how things are moving through the water. So you could actually see like where the gasoline and oil patches are within the marsh. At the same time, these are things that are amazingly abundant and really like interesting to consider eating. So that was the kind of real tension that I was trying to kind of capture between these two things. And then in terms of mapping, I was really specifically looking at specific kinds of plants where I knew that other kinds of pollution sources were coming from, so in the past. So that could include some of the dumping that was in Kingman Lake, or it could include Washington Gas and Light. It could include the kind of current trash transfer station, all of those things kind of along the way that I was looking at. There's also a really like heavy pollution of PCBs in the Anacostia, which is I think what a lot of attention goes to in terms of how that comes up through fish, and people eat fish, and that's a really like a way that people can get sick on a really clear timeline from things that come from the river. But it's not so clear how PCBs move through plant material. So that was kind of partly that what that mapping became was about first tracking like where PCBs were located, using some of the data from the Anacostia sediment group, and then kind of comparing that and contrasting that with where I was finding these plants. So in terms of preparing all of this material to share in the context of the exhibit, I've been working on preparing maps that are actually quite literal about where the plants have been found and where I've been kind of doing some of that testing, along with results of the testing. But I've also just been gathering information that will be available for people to take away during the exhibit in the spring of 2022 that includes information about these different plants and the kinds of pollutants that are in the river and where they are present in the plants and where they are not present in the plants. Then in addition to that, there'll be some information about some of the problems that I ran into that are still kind of going on as research topics, which is like, how do we actually address this question of where the organic pollutants come through in the plant material that's growing along the river?